He claimed that the monarch reportedly refused to speak with her grandson, Harry, on the phone without a witness.
But I would be very annoyed if I found that I'd been used in all these posts in a strange way by my parents.
So bad that Hugo Vickers said that he will never forgive Harry and Meghan for what they did to Queen Elizabeth.
Never forgive the Sussexes for the amount of stress they caused the Queen.
What Queen Elizabeth II answered, the room had to be prepared. Witness present, logbook ready, secondary recording device active.
And that's a kind of vivid example of how they can't trust them. But even beyond that,
Royal author Hugo Vickers has just revealed that the Queen was reportedly living in fear and deep concern because of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle.
Meghan allegedly being rude to Windsor gardeners. Tell us about that.
The grandmother for her grandson had to turn around and make sure there were witnesses present in case what they said was distorted.
I do happen to know that the Queen always used to make sure that she had somebody with her.
And so I think, as far as having somebody in the room, I think certainly there was one time is to stop them taking photographs.
Why did the Queen suspect the Sussexes were mic'd up on one visit to see her?
Breaking right now, shock details have emerged of Meghan Markle's behaviour while in the royal family.
The head gardener went up to the Queen and reported this, and the Queen got into her car and went down and tore a strip off her.
She allegedly worried that the private conversations she normally had with them could have been secretly recorded to later be leaked to the public.
she was doing a lot of that when they were over there for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee.
For the reasons that we've been talking about, that they might be taking photographs or, recording or anything they might be doing.
She was one of the most guarded women in modern history. 60 years on the throne, thousands of private meetings, conversations that shaped nations, resolved crises and buried secrets, and never left the room. But in the final years of her life, something changed. Not loudly, not in a press release, quietly, deliberately, in a way that only the people directly around her could even notice. And when royal historian Hugo Vickers finally put it in writing, it landed differently than the usual royal biography claims, because what he's describing isn't a story about a family argument that got out of hand. It's a story about a queen who began protecting her own words, inside her own palace, from her own grandson. If you want more deep dives like this, make sure you subscribe to Royal Archives. Hugo Vickers is not a tabloid commentator filling column inches. He is one of the most credentialed royal historians alive. He met Queen Elizabeth II over 40 times across 55 years. His new biography, Queen Elizabeth II, A Personal History, was published in April 2026, and it draws on 6 decades of close observation, never-before-seen sources, and the kind of proximity most royal authors never come close to. When Vickers makes a claim, it carries institutional weight behind it. He doesn't reach for sensation, he documents. And what he documents about the Queen's final years, about the slow, quiet erosion of trust between a grandmother and her grandson, is, by any standard, extraordinary. The fear, and Vickers uses that framing with precision, was that conversations inside palace walls were being recorded, off that Harry and Meghan might arrive at private meetings wired, ready to capture, prepared to preserve. When a journalist asked Vickers directly whether the Queen feared her conversations were being recorded for potential use in the Netflix documentary, he didn't hedge. He said, "Yes, wired for recording. It's always a possibility. I'm not saying it happened." 3 words of confirmation, 1 line of caution, and an entire behavioral apparatus that followed, because the Queen didn't just harbor a quiet fear and carry on as usual. She acted on it, methodically. When you look at them laid out together, reveal exactly how far the trust had actually collapsed. Start with the phone calls. From Vickers writes that the Queen reached a point where she refused to answer Harry's phone calls unless a witness was present in the room, someone positioned specifically to record what was actually said during those conversations. Sit with that for a moment. The Queen of England, in the final chapter of her reign, would not pick up the phone to speak with her own grandson without a witness beside her. Not protocol, not scheduling, not royal formality, a deliberate protective measure taken against the possibility that whatever was said might later be used in a way she couldn't control. That is not a strained relationship. That is a relationship where trust had been reduced to nothing, And when they met face to face, those conversations were different too. A lady-in-waiting began attending private meetings between the Queen and Harry, positioned, according to Vickers, as moral support and protection. Her purpose was to document what Harry said, to provide a counter-record from the Queen's side. Because at some point, Elizabeth II had decided that her own memory, the memory of a woman who had navigated the most complex political and family dynamics of the 20th century, was no longer sufficient protection on its own. Vickers was direct when pressed on what this represented. Trust had been broken, basically, he told the Daily Telegraph. So I think, as far as having somebody in the room, it was to stop them taking photographs or being wired or God knows what. God knows what. That phrase, from a man of Vickers' measured vocabulary, tells you everything about the atmosphere that had developed. And the picture he builds didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated. Can piece by piece, incident by incident, starting long before the Netflix documentary or the memoir or the Oprah interview. Vickers traces it further back, to the earliest signs that this relationship was more complicated than the public image suggested. Prince Philip, the Queen's husband of 73 years, had his own assessment of Meghan from the beginning. According to Vickers, Philip referred to her privately as the American. Not warmly, not with affection, just the American. A designation that carried, in Philip's world, a particular kind of skepticism. And the Queen's own attitude toward the wedding was captured in a single sentence relayed to Vickers by a person close to her. When asked about Harry and Meghan's plans to marry, her response was, "Go ahead, it doesn't affect me." Not a blessing. That's not a warm maternal endorsement. A flat, institutional shrug. Vickers also claims the Queen had privately advised Harry against rushing in. "Take a year," she reportedly told him. "Be certain." Harry didn't take the advice. And from that early moment of ignored counsel, a thread begins. One that runs, in Vickers' account, all the way to a Queen refusing to answer her grandson's phone calls without a witness holding a pen. But the relationship between the Queen and Meghan had its own fault lines entirely. Vickers documents one incident that reveals the Queen's standards, and her limits, with unusual clarity. After Harry and Meghan moved into Frogmore Cottage on the Windsor estate, one of the under-gardeners came to the Queen with a complaint. Meghan had been rude to him. The head gardener escalated the report, and the Queen's response, according to Vickers, was not a quiet word through an intermediary. She got into her car, drove down, and confronted Meghan herself. She flew into a rage, the book states, because you cannot be rude to staff. That was the line. Simple. Immovable. And then came March 7th, 2021. The Oprah interview. The timing alone was staggering. 6 days before the broadcast aired, Prince Philip, then 99 years old, had been admitted to St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London for a heart operation. Vickers writes that his medical team nearly lost him twice. Twice! While that was happening, and while the Queen was managing her husband's survival behind closed doors, the interview was being prepared for broadcast. When it aired on March 7th, Philip was still in hospital. Vickers writes that the Queen was dealing with Philip's precarious condition, carrying that privately while simultaneously absorbing the fallout from a globally televised interview in which her grandson described systematic failures inside the institution she had spent her life protecting. The royal family, Vickers says, were sickened by the timing, not just hurt. Sickened. And the Queen, whatever composed exterior she maintained publicly, was deeply hurt by what Vickers calls her grandson's attacks. That word, attacks, is a choice. Vickers doesn't use it accidentally. The specific details inside the Oprah interview raised questions that went beyond the content itself. Intimate conversations about Archie, about what was said before his birth, about internal family discussions. All of it surfaced publicly with a level of specificity that stopped people inside the palace. How had this information been preserved with such precision? How had private family conversations been recalled in such exact detail? Whether those questions were ever answered or even formally asked is unclear. But in palace circles, according to those around the Queen, they were circulating. And the Queen's response, documented now by Vickers, unfolded from there. One-word answers during conversations with Harry. That's what palace sources told Vickers. A woman known for her dry precision, her ability to put people at ease in any room, her command of a conversation, began giving yes and no responses. Nothing beyond the minimum. Not because she had nothing to say. Far because she had decided not to say it where she couldn't control what happened to it next. The incidents kept arriving. In 2021, 4 months after Philip was hospitalized and just weeks after his death in April, Harry announced he was writing a memoir. The book, Spare, arrived in January 2023. Alongside the Netflix documentary, released in December 2022, it peeled back layer after layer of what had been private. Names, conversations, decisions made in closed rooms, each release adding to what Vickers describes as distress that cannot be overestimated. That phrase, cannot be overestimated, is not rhetorical decoration from a man like Vickers. It is a precise, deliberate assessment from someone who spent 60 years watching this institution and is telling you plainly that the cumulative weight of what happened to this woman in her final years has not been fully absorbed by the public. Then there was the naming of Lilibet. When Harry and Meghan announced in June 2021 that their daughter would be named Lilibet, the intimate nickname used only by the Queen's closest family, coined because a young Princess Elizabeth couldn't pronounce her own name, used by her father, King George VI, and her husband, Prince Philip, alone. Vickers was direct about the reaction. To use the name that was used by her actual private family, he said, on the Daily Telegraph podcast. I know I don't think so. No. So, that's absolutely shocking. When asked whether Harry and Meghan had sought the Queen's permission or blessing before using the name, Vickers said they hadn't. They had claimed they did. His response, no, they didn't. That detail sits alongside everything else Vickers documents. And it fits the pattern. Not a single large betrayal. A sustained accumulation of moments where the Queen's private world was treated as available material. Her name, her conversations, her family's internal language, her late husband's hospital bedside as context for a television broadcast. And through all of it, she stayed composed in public, said the right things, issued the right statements. Some recollections may vary, was the palace's measured response to the Oprah interview. Dignified, controlled, exactly what the institution demanded. But Vickers's biography strips back the composure and shows what was happening behind it. A witness on every phone call, a lady in waiting in the room, answers shortened to monosyllables, a queen in her 90s carrying a husband's illness and a family fracture simultaneously, quietly building a system of self-protection around herself inside her own home. That's the story here, not the allegation of recording, which Vickers himself says he cannot confirm, the response to it. Because the response existed, it was documented, it happened, and it speaks to something far more significant than any single incident. Elizabeth II built her reign on discretion, on the iron management of what left the palace and what didn't, on being always the one who controlled the interior of the institution, and in her final years, the threat to that interior, by her own assessment reflected in her own actions, was coming from someone who had once been one of its most beloved members. Hugo Vickers chose to include this chapter, a man of 60 years access and 40 personal meetings with this woman. He put this in the book. That choice is itself a statement. There is still more inside this biography that hasn't been fully examined. What the Queen communicated in the weeks and months before her death at Balmoral on September 8, 2022, what those closest to her believe she was still carrying, and what she may have known about the shape of what was still to come after she was gone. Those threads are still being pulled. Make sure you're subscribed to Royal Archives and Niñas, because this story is far from over.